Greetings, Raise community. Brent coming in live from Iowa as I continue to work remotely this summer. Yesterday was our annual Raise Live conference. Check it out if you didn't get to join us live. It was an amazing day. This will probably be published about a month afterwards, but just kind of coming off of that and really excited to welcome Mike Bacon, who's the Vice President for Alumni Relations and Development at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, to today's podcast. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Brett. Glad to be here.
Well, we're super excited to catch up with you. And even before we started the episode, we were talking about, how we approached Raise this year, which was fully virtual with an in-studio component, and thinking about hybrid next year. And you were talking about some of the challenges you all are thinking through as it relates to hybrid. So we're going to get into that for sure. But one of the things I've been doing with recent guests that I've really enjoyed, and I think in your case, it's absolutely aligned, is to better understand your own higher education journey. Ultimately, you are one of the relatively few folks out there who is leading the advancement organization for your own alma mater. You probably didn't anticipate that when you were a junior in high school, thinking through next steps. And so I'd love to know who that guy was. Tell me about Mike in high school and ultimately what led you to Trinity.
Well, so I was looking for a good liberal arts college, and I grew up in Tulsa. So kind of looked regionally, I looked nationally too. And it really was kind of between Grinnell and Trinity. Came down to visit Trinity in November, and the weather looked like what's behind me. People were wearing shorts. I had a great time, and I just thought, okay, I can see myself here. And I've never regretted it.
Having grown up just north of Grinnell, it would not have looked quite like that in November for sure.
Exactly. I've since talked to a lot of friends who've been to Grinnell. Awesome place. But I've been really happy with the choice that I made here and the network I built.
And I know as a student, I saw in your bio that you did participate in the gateway drug to advancement known as the Phonathon. And so tell me, that kind of your catalyst to at least get some exposure to this space? I mean, I know you're involved as a student as well, but what were some of the highlights from your time at Trinity?
Oh, man. Well, okay, I'm going to make you laugh. I'm going to take off video. The photo that I have for my profile for Zoom is actually, hold on, let's see if I can just stop video, is me at the Phonathon
crushing
in the 1980s. And so I literally got involved as a student. It was all volunteer at the time, but the big kicker was at the time we had a donor who sent the top 5 callers on a trip to London. And so I was like, yes, I'm going to go for that. So first year I just participated, but the second year I think I was the top pledge getter. So it was the top 2 pledge getters, the top 2 fundraisers, and then a wild card. And so anyway, I got that for a couple years and loved it. And then as I was thinking about jobs, I was a history major. I didn't want to go to grad school. I wasn't going to be a lawyer. Didn't think I would be a teacher. Ironically, I've done a lot of teaching since. But as it turned out, I started reading through the Chronicle of Higher Education. And in those days, when it was just a print publication, there was a back section of all the ads. And so I started applying for jobs, and the Phonathon experience really helped when I did that. I also had a couple internships while I was a student for nonprofits. And so the day before I graduated, I got my one and only job offer from Kenyon College in Ohio. And I thought that was God telling me, take the job. So that was my first job. I went straight into the annual fund at Kenyon for my first couple years out at Trinity.
So you grow up in Tulsa, you go to college in San Antonio, you're hammering out the Phonathon calls, and then you, at 22, end up in Northern Ohio.
In Northern Ohio with all 4 seasons again.
Right.
I loved the people I worked with. It is a fine school. If you don't know Kenyon, it is a beautiful Gothic campus surrounded by cornfields. And, as much as I love the work, and I got to travel the country doing regional phonathons at that time, where we'd go to a city and gather alumni together to make calls to people in the area. I worked with the student phonathon program, did reunion giving and class agents, all the things you want to do early in your career. My family was here in Oklahoma and Texas, and when you can't wear shorts in March in Ohio, there's something wrong. So I knew I needed to get back to the South.
Before we go to that move, I saw something about the 100% senior giving program. Now we're talking 1990 roughly. What was the 100% senior giving program?
It was an early model, and I still think there's value in it, where we asked seniors as they graduated to make a 4-year ascending pledge. It could be 5, 10, 15, 20. It could be a higher increment. And we pitched it along the lines of make your gift, and it's basically the cup of, it's a 6-pack and a pizza, basically. But the idea was to get them to participate as they graduate, and then they'd be picked up in their 5th year by their class reunion. And so the challenge with those programs is always pledge redemption. But I would still tell you that even if they only got about half of the pledge redemption, it still would have been higher than most colleges that just try every year to try and get the alumni gift initially, because we did a lot of educating while they were still there as students about the value of that participatory gift. So I've tried to bring it to other places. One of the things the pushback I get from staff is that the pledge redemption is so low, but I still think there's value in a program like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've got to figure out a way as a sector to move past the era of the pledge. I know it's so ingrained in what we do, but I don't pledge to Spotify. I don't pledge to Netflix.
But what you do, Brent, is you do recurring gifts.
I recur. No, I know.
But I think you could morph
a
pledge program into a recurring credit card gift. You can figure out a way to do it through electronic funds transfer, something where it was painless.
Absolutely. And it just seems like, that's not a space where we directly sort of play at Evertrue, but it just feels like recurring subscription payments have gotten so easy. Why isn't that the 6-pack and the pizza, plus touchless, experiences for those seniors, right? And you were trying to do this in 1990 where there was no Apple Pay, there was no texting, there was no.
We weren't used to that concept.
PayPal, Venmo, whatever, and yet here we are in 2021 where we have all that stuff, but it's still not easy. And I think it's a reminder that it's not just about easy technology or easy recurring payments, because we have that now. It's that married with a compelling reason for somebody to subscribe, if you will.
Well, and never forget that the value of those programs is that you have got student leaders exerting some peer pressure on their fellow students. And so it's the idea of a volunteer approaching you to support a cause, and they're in your shoes. They're right there with you. So I think that's why those programs really do well, because a friend asks a friend to make a gift.
Exactly.
It's not amorphous emails and letters from the college president that you don't know, but it's your friends asking you to support. And that, of course, goes back to why we use that model, most of us, for reunions.
Right. Well, from Kenyon, you had 2 years without shorts in the winter. You made the move back to San Antonio. And my understanding is you were in an independent school context, basically serving as an inaugural leader. And so what definitely stands out about your early career is between rolling up your sleeves and hammering out the calls yourself as a student, doing some of the cat herding associated with volunteer management and really getting through those cycles, but then also assuming a leadership role in a very, I would imagine, nascent fundraising context with very little infrastructure. You had to roll up your sleeves and just, I'm sure, juggle a lot during that role. Tell me about the independent school world, which typically tends to be a little bit more parent oriented in nature, but what was your context?
So I was the first director of development at this school for boys, pre-K through 8th grade. But the great part was the school was 150 years old. So I really credit it with helping launch my kind of network in San Antonio. It was the kind of school where kind of all the families that were donors at other institutions in town sent their boys. And so I was able to meet grandparents, parents, kids who are now parents of their own kids at that school and are leaders in their own right. It really created a whole network for me within this community that I've come back to again and again. But it was, as you say, largely parent driven in terms of the activities on a yearly basis, But this little school had a fond spot in the hearts of the alumni. These guys would come back. I was planning 50th reunions for guys coming back to their 50th reunion of their 8th grade class. So it was a lot of fun. And I think my key takeaway, because it was, as you say, a lot of volunteer management, I just enjoyed it a lot. And I think what I really learned, it wasn't so much about me trying to get parents to like me, but it was them understanding how much I liked them. That they would go, if they knew I was depending upon them, they would go above and beyond to try and make something happen for me. And that really helped.
And what I wouldn't expect at this point in the journey in your career path is you would then say, and now I need my MBA, which is not very typical in this sector. And it doesn't totally fit the arc of where I might have saw things going for you.
Right.
So was it part of building that network? I'm sure there was a strong McCombs sort of MBA network within the philanthropic community in San Antonio. I mean, what was it that made you think about moving in that direction?
So it was a very intentional choice. I had worked with, in my role at the Academy, San Antonio Academy, I'd worked with a couple foundations, and I thought that what I wanted to do was work for a charitable foundation. So I sort of anticipated the best hire for a foundation would be somebody with a nonprofit background who understands fundraising, but also somebody who understood how to read a balance sheet and could use the tools that an MBA would give you. So I went to the University of Texas full-time program up in Austin, great place to live, especially back then, and got my MBA. And then in my last semester of the 2-year program, I got hired by a new foundation that was starting in San Antonio called the Kronkosky Foundation. And Mr. Kronkosky, when he died, was—
Before we jump into that, Mike,
yeah.
There probably weren't too many folks with your background in that program.
I felt like an alien at times.
That were coming in from Wall Street or coming in from consulting firms,
yes,
coming in from oil and gas, and you're the director of development at San Antonio Academy. What stood out as maybe some of the biggest, areas where you felt really stretched, but then maybe if there were areas where you felt like you were better positioned to contribute to the class discussions, et cetera?
So no doubt I was stretched. I had taken one accounting class at Trinity, pass fail, and that was just to make my dad happy at the time. So every semester I intentionally took accounting because I knew it was a tool in my toolbox that was pretty dull. So that statistics, accounting, those were the classes that I probably struggled the most with, but I knew I needed them. But, frankly, it was my Trinity education that helped me. In most business schools, it's a very participatory, case study driven. So it's the ability to present, the ability to write. And I feel like I walked out of college with those skills. So, but I was fascinated to see so many of my classmates that really struggled with being able to write a paper, make a point in a discussion, or present publicly. They were stressed out about it. But one thing I will tell you about business school, and I'm not saying it's right, but people tend to play to their strengths. So if you're on a team, the people that came out of an accounting background end up doing the analysis on the finances, and then the people who are good at speaking do the speaking. And you do that in a group setting because it helps the work go faster and more efficiently. It probably would have been better if we'd all switched roles and done the thing that we weren't as accustomed to. But so I feel like my natural strengths played well. And then I learned a lot because it was stuff that coming from a great liberal arts background, I hadn't really used those tools.
And you talked about the network you built serving in a development leadership role in a tight-knit San Antonio community, but I imagine it was a very different but equally important network that you built in business school. Really
statewide, although nationally, a lot of my classmates are all over the country. I also got involved when I was there in helping UT at the time had gotten dinged in the US News rankings because they didn't have alumni chapters. And so I got involved with a group of students that helped build what we called at the time the Graduate Business Network, but it was really an alumni association for the School of Texas Business School. And that was huge for me because it was using the skills I already had from the work I'd done in my nonprofit career and then putting them to work for UT as a volunteer. I ended up helping found the San Antonio chapter when I moved here, and then stayed involved on that board nationally. But that's really where I built a great network, not just with my classmates, but with other alumni and graduates of the program and then the people behind me.
I love it. And, I've had the opportunity to write letters of recommendation for business school applications among Evertrue staff. And then, in my kind of broader network, in particular through the Brown football community. And one of the things that I often encourage folks to highlight is if you working at a company like ours, where you have a lot of exposure to building and engaging alumni, both volunteer wise, but also philanthropically, or in the case of some of my friends at Brown that are serving as board members, for example, the Football Association, make sure to highlight that in your application. Let these admissions and enrollment officers see you not just as the student on campus, but let them see you as that young alumnus 5 years out, 10 years out, et cetera. And if you can sort of say, hey, look, like, here are all the reasons why I'll be a great fit and a compelling member of this class, but also I've got a track record that is going to make me a valuable contributor in your community for years to come. And I think people don't highlight that enough if they have pre-MBA alumni volunteer or development experience.
Such a good point. And in retrospect, I'm not even sure I highlighted that like I could have. I think about other leadership programs I've done since where I've made a point to emphasize a network and a community walking in. But I will tell you, anybody who's thinking about going to business school, think really carefully about what the state of that alumni association that you'll be becoming a part of is, because it is an ongoing resource to you for the rest of your life. It's the same thing we say at the undergrad level, but look for that at the graduate level too, because you want people in high places at companies specifically looking for alumni of their programs, MBA or undergraduate. That network is incredibly valuable.
Really well said. Really well said. So as you were sharing, your objective was to build the MBA toolkit and then potentially explore the charitable foundation world, which you did for a little bit before going down your own entrepreneurial path, which I'm really excited to learn more about.
So I did it for 2 years. I was a grants manager for this new foundation. The guy's estate he was the single largest shareholder of Merck Pharmaceutical when he died. And so it was started as the 7th largest foundation in the state of Texas, 300 million in assets. And I was a grants manager, which meant I worked with nonprofits as they applied for the money and went through the process. And at some point, you really try and become an advocate for them and what they're trying to accomplish. But the board makes the decisions around where the money goes. It was a good place to start, but it was increasingly paperwork. And because I was the guy with the MBA, I was really tasked with looking at all the financials. Won't surprise you, Brent, but I was shocked by how many of these dedicated nonprofit leaders would ask me, so what's a balance sheet again? Profit and loss? They literally struggled with the financial
side. As they
side.
were applying for grants, for example, you want some level of financial standing because you don't want to be throwing charitable foundation money after bad, let's say. And so you ended up almost having to coach.
I was a consultant, to all of them applying, because this foundation in particular had some fairly stringent financial requirements just to understand the context of, were they ready for the grant? And it was not part of the skill set of a lot of nonprofit leaders at that time. I keep hoping
and I don't think I've interviewed anyone who's worked at a foundation in the manner you're describing. And given that it's so concentrated with one family, I mean, it almost sounds like a family office, but the sort of other side of the coin, right? So for folks who aren't familiar, there are family offices are a growing part of the kind of investment community, where in the past it might be as a family that with significant wealth, we might just allocate our wealth out to third-party wealth advisors, Goldman Sachs, et cetera. But increasingly, family offices are building their own direct investing efforts. And so they will actually almost serve the role of venture capital or private equity investor, cutting checks directly into companies. It almost sounds like you were the nonprofit version of playing venture capitalists, where folks are coming in, pitching you, giving you the business model, and then you're basically deciding, does this hit our criteria or not?
Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it. I will tell you, the language wasn't there even in '98 when this was taking place. When I graduated from the University of Texas Macomb School, most of my classmates went out to work for startups. And so the language around pitching.
This was sort of .com.
It was the .com period. It was garden.com. It was everything. And then 3 years later, they were all back in consulting gigs because it imploded. But you're right. That language is still fairly new in the foundation world. You've got a couple of large foundations that will think of themselves as social entrepreneurs and will even consider loan programs. But for the most part, I would tell you the foundation world is still very traditional in the way it receives and grants money.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's to see the innovation that has happened to almost create marketplaces for startups. I mean, now you can literally have your pitch deck, log in online, distribute it to 1,000 investors, have people opt in, opt out. There's now crowdfunding, so consumers can get involved. Sounds like none of that's in place in the charitable.
I would guess if somebody were interviewing you, Brent, you would have a story to tell about the early years of Evertrue and kind of the steps you had to go through, because you were really getting this up and running during that period when pitching was becoming the norm.
Yeah, we really, I mean, I came out of the business plan contest at Harvard when I was finishing my MBA in 2010. And I remember pitching, basically the PowerPoint version of Evertrue 1.0. And I had an opportunity to pitch a gentleman from Google Ventures and Polaris, and there were a handful of venture firms. And I remember getting their scorecard. And it was a really competitive year. We had Birchbox, I think, won, which then went on to be an incredible success.
Right.
A friend had started a company called Relay Rides, which is now known as Turo, which has become like the Airbnb for renting out your car in your local neighborhood. And so there were really some amazing companies that year. But the feedback that I got from pitching those judges, I remember one of them wrote on the scorecard, "I would invest." And I was so blown away because there was like nothing to invest in. I'm like, I wouldn't.
You're like, in what?
What?
In you. They were going to invest in you, Brent.
But even then, I didn't really understand that. Yeah. That's what it comes down to at the beginning. I had no balance sheet. There were no financials. At the true seed stage, it literally is, do I believe in the market? Do I believe in the way this individual's thinking about addressing it? And then do I believe in this individual? And that's really what it came down to.
Well, what's funny, I told you when we started that there was a story about Evertrue and Trinity. And so after I left the foundation, I went into consulting, and we can talk about that. But in the process of my consulting work, I did that for about 15 years, loved it, nonprofit consulting. It's definitely in my blood. One of my longtime friends and a donor had befriended one of your salesmen because his daughter, I think, attended a private school. And if I'm remembering correctly, Evertrue really got its running start with independent and private schools before you sort of really hit the college market. And this guy reached out to me, and I put him in touch with Trinity University's office. Trinity was a client of mine at that time. And the lady who was the vice president, very smart lady, came out of a computer science background. And so I think she immediately saw how she could overlay Evertrue onto the legacy system that we still have and are frustrated by. But anyway, it's such a blessing now, here 6-7 years later, I get to benefit from something I recommended to her 7 years ago.
That is so neat. And I didn't remember that story, though I suspect if I go do some strategic searching of my inbox, I can find all of the breadcrumbs that would.
It was Jim. Jim was the guy.
Jim Zimmerman, that's right. Absolutely. So tell me a little bit about taking the leap into consulting. You said it's in your blood. You're passionate about it. it's not for the faint of heart. And I do think sometimes, even right now, when we talk about the great resignation, I see a fair number of advancement professionals maybe making the leap to consulting firms or startups with perhaps a grass is always greener sort of lens right now. But you took the leap basically in the heart of the dot-com boom. You were then consulting through 9/11. You're consulting through the real estate boom and bust. You're consulting, through the sort of remnants of the financial crisis, and we're able to make it work. I mean,
Yeah.
tell me about some of the highs and lows on that journey. And first and foremost, what inspired you to take the leap?
Well, so I knew that for me at the time, the foundation I was working at was not a long-term plan. And I had worked with enough nonprofits, and I had been very engaged in our local Association of Fundraising Professionals chapter, AFP. And so I had a good network, and I basically thought, let me just try this to see if it'll work. And within 6 months, I was making more money as a consultant than I'd made at the foundation. So I figured, okay, at least financially, that affirms that this is a good choice for now. So much of what I did, especially when you're working with younger nonprofits, you've got these amazing executive directors that have a vision and are focused on their mission. But what they're not good at is finances. They're not good at planning necessarily. And nobody's ever taught them how to raise money. And so I really tried to focus there on that intersection of fundraising and then how to get your board and volunteers engaged in the work. So it's not just you as an executive director doing it all by yourself. And that seemed to really speak to people. They knew that their boards were supposed to be more involved, but they didn't know how to ask, and they certainly didn't know how to train them. And then they were all freaked out about losing some measure of control if the board got more engaged, even though I know I should engage my board. If they're that engaged, are they going to fire me? And so, you really had to sort of walk them through how they can actually be a more effective leader if their board were engaged in the fundraising. And
so it sounds like you were very hands-on. And also when I compare it to maybe our world, for example, early on in a startup journey, you might really benefit from a fractional CFO, somebody who has the skill set and the background that you probably couldn't afford to hire full-time, but frankly, you don't even have enough work for somebody to do it maybe full-time. And you can do the same thing with agencies or a fractional CTO in some cases. It sounds like you were almost playing that fractional business partner for folks that maybe had the passion and the desire to drive change, but didn't have that same toolkit, if you will.
So what you're saying makes complete sense, but I got to be honest, Brent, I chose the opposite approach.
Okay.
When you're in consulting, you have to make a pretty early call. Am I going to be a strategic consultant or an implementation consultant?
Okay.
So what you've just described is a great model for a lot of people who basically become your hireable part-time development person.
Mm-hmm.
What I realized early on about that model is that you can work 3 to 4 clients and all your time is taken, especially if they expect to see you face to face. Right. That may be a day or two here or there, but your week pretty much gets stacked up. But if you are a strategic consultant, you're developing the plans for, we had something we called a strategic development plan. We put together a plan for 2 to 3 years, and then we train their staff on how to implement it. And then we get brought in repeatedly for kind of ongoing assistance. I could work 13 to 15 of those clients.
Interesting.
So it was an early choice. My partner and I had a great partner. Her name is Marion Lee. She still has the consulting firm, now as her name. But man, we did such great work because not only did we take the strategic approach, but we would always put 2 consultants on every project. One, it was just more fun. If you're not just by yourself working all the time, you've got somebody that you share the workload. But then 2, one of the big challenges for individual consultants is if I'm not working, I'm not making money. And when do I take vacation? So by creating a team of 2 consultants on every project, when one of us took off, the other one was not missing a beat. You still had somebody on the team that was guiding the project.
And it almost sounds like you built in maybe not a directly recurring revenue model, but it was sort of set up in a way where you would have that ongoing relationship as opposed to come in, do a really deep dive for 6 months,
And
get
then be out of there.
check and go out. And maybe that's part of what helped you weather some of those ups and downs, which can certainly have a big impact on consulting firms, as you know, as I think many experienced even last year during the pandemic, for example.
Well, I got to tell you, in 2008 and 9, when we had the housing recession, we were both worried. And ironically, I think we had one of our strongest years. And it was mainly because our clients, the nonprofits, knew that they needed help more than ever. They were worried about the effect of the economy on their donors and their ability to give. And so they had to be better at their plans and more strategic. And but thank God we'd been in business a good 8 years before that happened. Had that happened right at the start of a consulting firm's work, it would have been a true struggle. And I've talked to my partner. Now, I've been here at Trinity. It's hard to believe it's 6 years. And my partner is a close friend, the godmother to my kids. I keep in touch with her, my former partner. And she said that this year during the pandemic, it was the same case, that she had more business than she anticipated because people really knew they needed the right help to leverage what they were trying to do.
So during that journey, Trinity was, I know, close to you throughout. I know you were very engaged as an alumnus of Trinity. Were there like 5 times along the way that you almost stepped in roles, or did the stars just align this one moment back in 2015?
It's funny because I did stay involved as an alum, local board, and then I was the president of our national alumni board. I sort of did feel like I always had some unfinished business with Trinity. But the guy who was truly my mentor, his name was Mark Rainey. Mark was the president, VP for Alumni Relations and Development for 30 years. And so during kind of all this time up to what you and I have been talking about, he was still at Trinity. And then we had a president come in, and as new presidents do, they oftentimes realign their executive committee. So Mark was no longer at Trinity. He then had 2 hires, and each of them lasted about 2 years. And so then the university made the decision to hire a new president. And it was then that faculty started calling me and saying, hey, you guy coming in, would you ever throw your hat in the ring? And at this point, Brent, I'd been consulting for 15 years. But one of my clients steadily through all of that kind of chaotic period for the university had been the university. We also did job search work. So I would help find development officers for the university. And then 2 years later, they would call me on their way out the door. And so I knew what was going on. And so I got to meet the president before I threw my hat in the ring. I felt like, okay, I could see working with this guy. Danny Anderson was the former dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at KU, but he had gone to Austin College. He was from Texas. He kind of understood, he definitely understood a liberal arts, what it was going to take to run a liberal arts university. So I threw my hat in the ring. My partner and I, after I took the job, we separated out and she bought my half of the company from me, which was gracious of her. I never would have anticipated that. And it has been a really good choice because I've been able to bring this network to bear for a college that I love. And like you said, the chance to work at your own alma mater is, I mean, there's nothing better because there's no learning curve. I will tell you, we can talk about this if you want, but learning how to manage people is a learning curve when you've come out of consulting. But there's no learning curve with relation to what the mission is and how investors can make a difference.
I do want to talk about that because in a certain regard, in spite of it almost feeling like you know, your whole life's work led up to really great alignment with this role, the role leading the team as you are now, serving on the university leadership team, could not be more different than strategic advisory going mile wide, inch deep with 13 to 15 clients versus boom, going all in on one organization, the people, the challenges, the systems. I mean, you know, there's a level of getting to fly above a lot of the nitty gritty work in a consulting context that now is on your desk and in your inbox and in your text messages, I'm sure, on a daily, nightly basis.
right on. And there have been days when I have quietly yearned for my consulting role, but I also know that, especially when you can measure the progress, not only in terms of the dollars raised, but in the way you're changing the dynamics of a team, I get to see that progress daily, and it's powerful because it's working. So as a consultant, I maybe, we had about 8 consultants at our peak, but I was really it was more partnering. Do you want to, Brent, let's you and I work on this together. You do this part, I'll do that part. That's very different than now I've got 50 staff members. And so I will tell you that I think about 90% of management is common sense and treating people fairly the way you would want to be treated. And then there's that 10% where I had no idea that was the way you were supposed to do that. Totally would not have guessed that I was supposed to make that choice instead of the one I did. So in my first couple of years, I struggled with that 10% because there were a lot of HR things that, not having come out of higher ed for years. I'd started my career in higher ed, but then it had been a good 25 years since I had been in higher ed. So I was not only reacclimating to this strange world that is higher education, but I was also, I had 7 direct reports and trying to go through the evaluation process and none of the things you do as a consultant. So it was a learning curve. But one of the things I pride myself on is recruiting good people. And over this time, I've been able to put together the team, working with the people I already had, but also recruiting some key staff members in roles that have enabled me to get out of the daily operational work and into the work of a vice president is helping the president at the principal gift level and engaging the board. And so if I were being critical of myself, my first 3 years, I didn't do a good job of that part of it because I was working so hard to sort of find a rhythm again with my team. But now I'm at the point where, and especially as we're in this comprehensive campaign, that's exactly the work I get to do every day.
When you think about the last 6 years, what are you most proud of that your team has accomplished? And when you think about the next 6 years, what are the most aspirational goals that you feel like you all might be able to tackle, but they're not a sure thing?
It's a good question. So the last 6 years, when I literally within my first month, I went to a happy hour. This would have been 2015. I went to a faculty happy hour and one of the faculty members over a drink leans over to me and says, "Your department's really screwed up. You know that, right?" I was just like, "Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's why I'm here."
Good, honest candor. We take
it
that.
It was. Although her department academically was pretty screwed up too. I came to learn years later. But anyway, side note. So anyway, I think the thing I'm most proudest of is we have changed the dynamic of the people culture within our office. And we went from about 37 people to now 50 people. We were lucky to approach one of our longtime foundation funders for a planning grant related to campaign expenses. So as I was sort of building the runway for this comprehensive campaign, I was able to strategically add people in prospect research, major gift officers, alumni relations teams. So I was able to build out the team to fill in some holes, so recruited new people, and then spent a lot of time on culture and working as a team. I'm sure you hear this from the people you interview, but it's so easy, especially in a somewhat good-sized shop, to have a lot of silos. Like we had a Chinese wall between alumni relations and fundraising. One was fundraising, one was fundraising. We literally would have somebody go to Houston to see somebody only to find out that somebody from the alumni relations office had visited that same person the week before. So we didn't have communication. We had people making goals just for their own departments. And so one of the first things I did was take my senior team of about 7 and say, you all have your great goals for within your departments, but we need goals as a team. Like, what are our goals as the 7? This is team 1. And so we've spent a lot of time working towards culture goals and hiring goals and the feel of the team as a group, because we share that. And then they still, share with one another their individual department goals. And that's been a huge help.
And as you think about having that foundation and alignment and communication and culture at least worked out or improved, where might you be able to go?
Where we headed next? So Trinity is embarked on, we're in the quiet phase of the largest campaign in our history. Right now, it will probably be around 300 million. The beauty of being in a quiet phase is we can change that goal if we need to before we need to go truly public with it. Ironically, and you know this from talking to your clients, the old school quiet phase and not announcing gifts until you're 50, 60%, that's really no longer the case. Now, more and more, you're seeing colleges, even as they begin campaigns, announcing large lead gifts to keep momentum going. And it's quite possible to also argue that most colleges are always in a big campaign. So there's never any, you're shifting from one initiative to the next.
You but think I think louder than the quiet phase of the campaign. That's what I've
it gets pretty loud. So we're still in theory in the leadership phase. We've hit almost 100% of our board giving. We're setting new records every year. So that's all good to me. As you talk about challenges, I always think about the challenge of keeping and retaining great staff. And so to me, the longer we can keep somebody on the team, the deeper their relationships. Mark Rainey, my mentor, the former VP, told me that he always felt like a development officer really wasn't hitting their stride until 5 years into the job. Mm. And yet, if you look at the resume of 90% of the applicants for any job in fundraising, you'll see that 3 to 4 years, they're always going to the next place. In part, that's because it's an opportunity to get a raise or it's an opportunity to get a larger role. But when you think about the effect on our institutions, every time somebody leaves after 3 or 4 years, we've got a new development officer coming in and starting from scratch, building relationships. You know that it takes 3-4 visits before you really get to the conversation around a bigger gift. And so you lose a lot of your rhythm with that kind of turnover.
I do want to ask you, as we sit here in late July 2021, hybrid, right? We did our Raise Live conference yesterday, and we did it fully virtual with an in-office live MC experience from my colleagues Mike and Caroline, because we just, with the planning cycle, we didn't think it was going to be realistic to have an in-person experience. Right. Just like most folks in your shoes struggled with the sort of traditional reunion cycle or had to navigate various scenarios with commencement this year. And so we decided to sort of keep it simple, do it online. It was a great production. We learned so much in doing it, but we do miss the in-person vibe. I'd love to have you and your team up in Boston so that in addition to a day of inspiring content, we can go and
have a drink and
have a drink at the Barking Crab or really connect one-on-one. And so we are now already one day after the conference thinking about, okay, what might the future be where we can balance both accessibility and scale through virtual high quality experiences, but also bring back more of that human to human connection. And so most fundraising leaders, after a year of having that question answered for you, are now trying to figure out how to recalibrate. And before we get into your views on hybrid and some of the things you're wrestling with, I do want to hear your story about closing maybe the largest gift in your career, maybe for Trinity ever, over Zoom, and what that was like.
If you had asked me, Brent, 3 years ago, would you ever close gifts over Zoom? I would have told you there's no way. It doesn't make up for being in person with somebody, the respect you show them by coming to their office or their home, and the body language, all of that is critical. But the beauty of having a dedicated board who knows where you are in the trajectory of your campaign and feels ownership for that campaign is that they know that now is the time. It's not 6 months from now. It's not a year from now. We've got to reach 100% of our board giving, and we need stretch gifts. And so there have been 2 cases where 2 of the largest gifts to the university were done over a Zoom meeting. The first was my president and our board chair approaching a long-term family, and they made a wonderful gift. And they did it over Zoom. They were out on their boat, cruising, staying safe in the waters off the coast. And we, of course, were all doing it from our computers. But then the other gift was really happened in the process of recruiting kind of a chair for this campaign. He's the honorary chair. He also wanted to be more involved in that, which happily surprised me. So he's also getting involved in solicitations. but he's a big believer that he had to make his own gift before he could ask anybody to step up into that level. And so my role was to talk to him about it and get it all set up so the president could solicit him, because it was important to me that my president get the ability to make that ask. And he says, here's what I'm going to do. And he told us the gift. I'm like, oh, that's great. I'm so excited. Let me have Danny call you next week and we'll get, he's like, no, don't waste his time. This is what I'm doing. He doesn't need to call me. I was just like, man.
Mike, does that mean 3 years ago, you're not alone in assuming, or you're not alone in stating you never would have imagined having conversations like that over Zoom?
Right.
Certainly not with somebody on their boat with the president and somebody else in Zoom boxes. Does that mean we were maybe just wrong? I mean, maybe we were flawed in our assumptions that the body language and the in-person, and we do need all of that because it's just the way we've always done it. But what I heard from you in both those cases were the donors didn't feel like they needed all of that. And so is it that we as fundraisers think we need it? But we sort of convince ourselves they need it? And as you think about a year from now, is it possible that with no travel restrictions and lots of comfort in getting together in person, you'll still be soliciting 7-figure gifts over Zoom if that's what the donor is comfortable doing?
Well, so I think you make a really good point. The paradigm has shifted, but I wouldn't so much say we're wrong as it's evolved. Like during COVID, it was, we did not have options. And so people made the best with the tools. And then I think we've all been surprised by how efficient the tools are. Like the idea of getting you together with my president and a board chair who lives in another part of the country. I have to get you all flown into the same place on the same day. That takes a lot of work. And yet to get an hour of your time with everybody sitting at their desks is so much easier.
Not only easier, some might argue it's a better experience for all parties. It's more cost effective for the university that people care deeply about. And so that's where we really just wonder where things might settle out, because what you're hinting at is maybe we weren't wrong 3 years ago. We just went through one of the most rapid changes in technology adoption in history, right? When you think about how long it took people to adopt email in the mid to late 90s versus how quickly we all adopted Zoom and Teams and Slack in the 2020 period, there's no comparison. It was like an overnight transformation. And just like once you start sending emails, you don't unlearn that.
Right.
We're not going to unlearn our ability to do this. And those same board members and trustees are going to be closing on houses remotely, and they're going to be making other large financial decisions remotely. And there's no reason to assume that philanthropy can't scale more virtually, even post-pandemic, even though we might be tired of Zoom.
So I agree with that, but here's my worry, Brent. These relationships were founded based on lots of personal interaction. And so then to have a Zoom call where I ask you for a significant gift after we've known each other for 5 years, it seems timely and efficient, and because we already have this great relationship. But when I think about trying to form a relationship with you, and you and I have never met before, we've never been together in person, and using Zoom as our only tool to do that, that's where I think this is going to break down. You might do, I worry that Zoom may lead us to a transactional zone of fundraising for a business that's always been relational. And the fact that we can go have lunch together and talk about our families and then eventually talk about a gift, although I never recommend having a gift over lunch, I still think there's value in that. And so I worry about the gift after this and the one after that. If we still have never met and we're always doing this by Zoom, I think we're missing this opportunity to create a relationship that has nothing to do with the gift.
I agree with you, Mike, but I also think when you talk about transactional versus relationship oriented, the reality is that very few of us as donors have true relationships. And our data suggests fewer than 2% of prospects are assigned to gift officers in the current construct. And so for 2% of people, they might have the opportunity today to build a one-on-one relationship. And we all know that even within that 2% of assigned prospects, the quality of experience based on turnover or inconsistency of outreach is very different. So now maybe we cut that in half and we've got 1% of the population having a true relationship. And at least historically, that has meant that for the rest of us, it's the call center hitting us up. It's the mass email now.
It's the giving day, right?
Guess what? There is nothing less relationship based, more transactional than a giving day. And so that's where I struggle. And I think from where I sit, thinking about ways that we could be more relationship driven via Zoom, for example, even if it's not as relationship driven as getting together in person, right, far better of an experience than a transactional give now, give now, give now, give now.
Right.
So click that's here, sort of the balance we need to strike as a community.
I agree. And I think I was approaching it from the principal gift standpoint.
Absolutely.
Those biggest gifts, I do think there's always going to have to be a personal element, but you're right on with the vast majority of our donors only get that ask through some electronic means. And so what you hope is that the 4 years they spent here, or as a parent, the experience their kid has, that's enough emotional connection to make the decision when it comes time for the ask.
Yeah. And what we're really excited about now is how do we sort of leveraging not just Zoom, leveraging video, leveraging the student voice.
Yes.
You know, the 2020 version of your Zoom image hitting the phones in the 80s, unfortunately for a lot of universities, it still looks way too much like what you were doing in the 80s in spite of massive leaps in technology. Right. And people are rebranding their call centers as engagement centers, but it's still a transactional, high volume, impersonal.
You still have a room with 20 phones in it, right, where students make calls.
And there is such an opportunity to, I think, evolve beyond that to create more of that authentic relationship building experience deeper in the giving pyramid, while not sacrificing the critical work at the top of the pyramid that ultimately will make or break the campaigns.
Yeah, I think the future is bright for this field. I tell students graduating from college that if you can overcome your fear about talking about money and asking for a gift, you will have a career for the rest of your life and job opportunities that pay well. Because this is just, if you've got the heart for this work, there will always be a need for great fundraisers.
And you can do it anywhere, big cities, small cities, globally, domestically,
remotely.
You name it. Remotely. So let's talk about that, because I think the one last thing that I wanted to cover, we asked you what you thought might be the next step forward for the sector. You said that the pipelines for recruiting gift officer talent are old and tired, not pulling any punches with that statement. So why do you feel that way? And I think maybe in the context of a more remote future, how might we address it?
Well, what I'm going to say, I'm just being transparent, it won't surprise you, but most colleges, when they're recruiting for a gift officer, they look for resumes of people who've worked at similar colleges. Great, good to have it if you can find it. But not only is it difficult to find, but that inherent filter limits who you're looking at from day one. We'd never consider somebody who worked at a community college. We'd never consider somebody who worked for a social service agency. And especially as we're all trying to deal with the challenge of diversifying our workforce and trying to have more employees of color, if we keep relying on just somebody who's worked at a college just like us, then we're leaving on the table those resumes of people who have all the skills, have the right characteristics, but just haven't held those jobs. So even as we do searches now, I've really encouraged my team, don't just look at the resumes of people who have had higher ed experience, go across the spectrum, and then even think about maybe somebody comes out of a sales background or a volunteer management role, something, maybe they worked for a sports team, anything that can be applicable that just shows you that they've got the skills. They don't have to have the same experience.
And one of the things we're really focused on as well is how do we really create an on-ramp from your student population? I mean, we hear time and again, some of our, when you look at the composition of the student caller community, it often can be a much more diverse group of students than you might see within the advancement staff more broadly. But there has just not been a natural on-ramp to go from roles like that into a more junior development type role, because oftentimes we want the major gift officer with 4 years of experience, et cetera, et cetera. And so how do we sort of look at this homegrown talent pipeline potentially being a competitive advantage as well?
The models I've heard of schools that are doing it well is they create some official internship or 2-year position within the framework. So they're recruiting kids straight out of their phone-a-thon program to work for this official role for 2 years. And that's really a budgeting. If you've got the budget to do it, I think it's brilliant. All of us, I can speak for most of us, have just gone through a budget cutting year and probably at least one more year ahead of budget cutting related to the effects of the lack of room and board on our budgets during COVID. So, but if you could figure out a way to create a pipeline like that's an official program, I think that's a huge advantage. We get involved with our student leaders as they graduate to help them try and find jobs. If any of them have an interest in fundraising, I am sending their resumes out to people. I am trying to find them gigs that at other nonprofits because I want them to get right into it. And I think most people have come to realize that when you hire a Trinity student, you've got somebody who can read, who can write, who's a hard worker. And so it's working on a small scale, but to your point, it's a problem throughout our field.
Well, Mike, thank you so much. This hour has flown by. Your perspective is super helpful. Your passion for Trinity and the field is so impressive. And I do want to give you the opportunity, if you are, budget challenges aside, thinking about staffing back up in the coming year or two. Are there roles that folks who are listening should be aware of right now? And also, I know you're active on LinkedIn. Is that the best way to stay in touch?
You bet. LinkedIn, I'm very active there. Please reach out to me. We have probably 5 or 6 positions that we're hiring for. We've just come off of a budget hiring freeze. The floodgates are now open. So we're hiring for annual giving positions. We're able to expand our stewardship team. We're actually adding another Plan Giving, sort of kind of an assistant director of Plan Giving. So that could be somebody out of the legal background. Or somebody with a propensity for those kinds of transactions. And then we're going to be hiring some gift officers. So I feel like we're going to get a whole new batch of strong people into the team.
Super exciting. Mike, thank you for your partnership, for sharing your perspective. And we really look forward to continuing to collaborate on some of these big ideas in the years to come. So best wishes as you continue to march through the loud phase of the quiet campaign. All right.
Well, Brent, thank you. And I know in no way at all is this meant to be kind of an advocacy for EverTrue, but I do want you to know that we could not be having the success we've had using the legacy system that we inherited without the agility that EverTrue has given us. So I am really grateful that we've had it as a tool. We're going through digital transformation. We're going to head into AffiniQuest and Salesforce and all the great new world, the brave new world ahead. But I don't think the last 6 years could have happened successfully without us having that tool for our team.
Well, we feel like we're still just getting started, and I'm optimistic the next 6 years will have opportunities for even greater transformation. So best wishes, Mike. Have a terrific Friday here, and we'll talk soon. Brent, signing off with Mike Bacon from Trinity University. Take care, everyone.